The stress response, it's something that we've all heard of, and intuitively we kind of know what it does, but I want to go into a little bit more about how it actually works and how stress is good. Stress is survival. The stress response actually moves us out of danger. However, it's when that stress response is dialed up and we can't dial it back, that's when potentially we're looking at something chronic. And the CDC talk about anything that interferes with our day-to-day living, that impacts us psychologically and or physiologically for a period of 12 months or more, that we could be looking at something chronic. So what does this actually do? How does this affect the brain? If we are encountered with a stressor on the outside of us, something occurs, we register that in what's called the occipital lobe. It's the visual cortex of the brain, passes through the thalamus and then registers back in the visual cortex. We see that threat. And then if that threat is a true threat to us, this we call the fast track, straight from the occipital lobe through to the amygdalas. And there's an amygdala in each hemisphere of the brain. And the amygdala begins a process called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis. And what this does is the amygdalas signal what's called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus begins to release what's called corticotrophin releasing hormone, a hormone that secretes slightly down in the brain to an area called the pituitary gland. This pituitary gland then starts to secrete what is called adrenocorticotropic hormone. And this enters our bloodstream and goes rushing down to those adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands produce that good old stress hormone that all of us have heard of, called cortisol. Now, large amounts of cortisol racing through the brain and also the body. This passes the blood-brain barrier, enters into an area called the hippocampus. And as soon as this hippocampus gets large amounts of cortisol, it checks in with the hypothalamus to say, hey, is the stressor still there? If it's not, then that HPA axis down regulates and we move on and we self-regulate back. However, because of the size of our frontal lobe, takes up around 40% of the total landscape of the outer area of the brain, we can turn on this same stress response just by thought alone. This means we don't need that external event. We could turn it on by this, and these large amounts of cortisol continue to circle and begin to weaken certain areas of the brain. Now, especially in that emotional area of the brain, that's called the limbic system. So part of the limbic system is the hippocampus, is also the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus and the thalamus. All these areas are part of the limbic system. And this emotional area of the brain continues this cycle, and over a period of time it begins to weaken other areas of the brain and actually keep the amygdalas highly active. And this is when potentially we could be heading for something chronic. So how do we self-regulate and move ourselves out of this? We run people through the technique called the 4 to restore. I'm not going to go into it here because there's videos that we've done in the past on the 4 to restore. But practicing this has been proven to slow this HPA axis down and down-regulate and self-regulate back into balance. Give it a go and let me know any questions.